Hi, this is Mark Ivan Cole for Hahnemühle Paper, and I'm really enjoying this gray watercolor toned paper. I've very much appreciated having it on the trip that I just came back from. The photo reference that I'm using today is from the trail near Lunch Creek in Glacier National Park, United States of America, in Montana. The fall colors were just getting started, but all of the undergrowth at high altitude was just on fire. It was beautiful. And I spent some time painting that while I was on the road using Derwent ink tints. So today I'm also using Derwent ink tints on the watercolor paper. I'm using the ink blocks. Now I know they make an ink tints watercolor pan set now, which is pretty cool. It's not watercolor, it's actually ink. So it's dried ink in blocks that have been put into pans for as like a watercolor pan would be. And I'm interested in that, but they don't have as many colors as I do because I started with their 24 color block set. And you can just see it off to the side here. My setup is such that I actually have a folding clipboard. You can see the clip on top. And I use a folding clipboard with a rubber band holding a pencil box on the left-hand side. And in that pencil box are all 24 colors except for white. So 23 out of 24 colors from the Derwent Ink Tints ink block set that you can get. And I've broken those blocks into thirds so I don't use them all up all at once. And I can fit those 23 into clay. I just embed them in clay inside the watercolor, the pencil box. Now this kit, that I'm using right now is sort of version 2.0 of that. And it's been excellent for taking on the road with me. This kit has been, some version of this kit has been around the world with me. I've done it, the only place I couldn't take it actually was the Taj Mahal. They don't allow any ink of any sort in there. But I really wish I'd had this paper at that time. This is, as you can see, it's gray tone. It's actually not white. It's almost a lavender. I just did all the drawing in with a number 2 mechanical pencil. And I use a water brush directly on those little blocks, just like they were pan watercolors, as I noted earlier. And I paint straight on. I don't do any mixing at all elsewhere. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that. You can use the lid to the pencil box as a mixing pad or mixing tray. I mentioned to my son, who also works in ink, I said, never realized you could actually mix stuff on there. I've always been painting direct. And he goes, why would you do that to yourself? Which I thought was great. But what I've discovered when I do this, I've gone back to not doing any mixing outside for a couple of reasons. One of them, which you just saw, I went from the blue. I usually start with the blue because that has to stay clean. And then I just keep mixing as I go. And what that does is it maintains a certain amount of color harmony. It also makes sure that I have to plan ahead a little bit, but it keeps it from getting too stiff. And I tend to like looser stuff if I can get it, because I tend to get stiff. It's very easy for me to get stiff. So there I'm grabbing some yellow, and I've got the yellow and orange next to each other. So if I switch around between the two, if I actually wet the brush and then wipe both of them, I get varying mixtures of yellow and orange. Where did I go back to here? Yeah, here I'm going to get some of that yellow into the water. There's a creek that flows right through here. This is Lunch Creek, which I thought was a great word because that's really what you want to do there. It just absolutely beautiful. They've made it possible that right off the road you can sit at a picnic bench and actually have lunch at Lunch Creek. One of the things I'd like to point out about the gray toned paper, I found it really conducive for me for the natural landscape. I like the cooler background. I think a lot can be done with the warmer background because they do have the cappuccino, and I've tried it. And for this particular medium, I was not as happy with my results. You might actually enjoy it better, but I like to start with a cooler background and add the warmth on top. I had a bit of a hard time getting cooler colors to look good on the cappuccino, but that was me. And it's also this medium. So your watercolor or gouache, I think, would be tremendous on this. I'm so tempted to pick up a set of gouache, but I have too many media to work with already. So one of the things I like about the Derwent Inktense on this paper is that the paper will absorb it at a manageable rate. You know what I mean by that? A lot of times, if it's too light, this is 200 grams per square meter on this, so 200 GSM, and that's about it's about as light as I'd want to get with a watercolor paper. Now the surface here is not particularly rough, and I've learned to really enjoy the rough, so I think I would have liked to have some rougher options for this, but I really like what I can get with the texture it's got. You'll notice that when I flick up with the side of the brush, that I try to lift off the paper and let the top be a little bit more ragged. Now here I'm actually working the back distance, and as you see, I wiped it off with the side of my finger. I always end up with an inky finger when I do this. Right now I'm putting in most of the lighter colors because the darker ones can always be added later. And again, as noted at the beginning of the video, this is done at double speed, so it's the movements are twice as fast as normal. You see, I went straight from that orange to the green. There's the kit. You can see it there. Ah, yes, a wonderful tool. Some sort of tissue or paper towel just to make sure that those little dots don't show up too strongly. A lot of times the ink will pool on the end, and I don't like the way it leaves a dot there. Try to avoid that when I can. Sometimes it's just a matter of lightly grazing the tissue across the top, and it'll take the dot away without taking too much ink off. Otherwise, the back of the little finger often does the job. Like that. Just defining this group of bushes back there that kind of defines the side of the hill. The blue up on top is actually not sky. That's kind of hard to show here, and I think I'd fix it a bit later because it is definitely not sky. It's the blue of the mountains in the back. And as you may know from being outdoors, every single place has a slightly different atmosphere to it. And the Glacier National Park atmosphere on a sunny day, which this was, is stunningly blue. It's really just exciting. There's so much atmosphere back there, and the mountains are huge. And when you're walking among them, this is looking across the valley and a lake right up towards some of the peaks. I'll have to figure out the names of them again. I didn't get a chance to memorize them while we were there. We were there for 2 days. This is right off of Going to the Sun Road. Another thing to note here, if you get too much water going, it will actually smudge in quite a bit, and it makes it a little harder to work with. So I'm constantly working around the area to see what's dry enough, like I'm moving away to paint here because that's not dry enough up there. That water brush, that little bit of water in there, that'll last me for the whole painting. Good old tissues. Again, with the watercolor, as always, you're trying to preserve the white, and you're also working from lighter to darker. I think if I were to do this one again, I would actually put in the tree trunks first. And see if I can get those to kind of hang out longer as ghost images, and then reinforce them afterwards. Just let them dry completely. Now I'm blocking in all of the blue shadows, which were truly blue because they're reflecting such a blue sky that day. The sun was out. Got a little bit of sunburn, but not too bad. But oh my gosh, what a view. If you ever get a chance to go to Glacier National Park, go. It's been on my bucket list for ages, and we finally went, and it was every bit as spectacular as one would think. Without having drawn these in, I'm just going for the shadows. A little bit darker blue. A little too much water there. So I try to press it out. Toning the area here a bit, which is going to eventually be much darker. Now that I got some drier stuff back in there, I can count on my textures to be closer to what I want. So I can make that a bit more intense without just creating a puddle. So as with all watercolor-like media, you've got two things that are drying at once. One of which is the paper, and the other of which is, well, three things, I guess. You got the paper, you've got the pan of color, and you have the brush, and they're all drying. And fortunately, since I'm doing this indoors in the studio, it's not drying too fast. Out in the sun, it can dry really fast. And so you're always trying to manage, is my brush dry? Is the ink block dry? And is the paper dry? And if so, what's the combination that's going to get the texture I want? But I like the fact that you can actually work your textures with this. This is an old brush. It's been around, oh, I don't know how many paintings this one's done. And sometimes I like having the older brush because you get more of a ragged top of it because it's been against this rougher paper for a while. And I like that. I like having a little bit of texture there. And I'm using only one brush. The entire thing, I use one brush. And that's helped me a lot when I'm painting plein air. It very little setup. This setup for this kit is probably 90 seconds max, and I'm ready to paint. And teardown is less than a minute. So if I need to just paint something quickly and then take off somewhere because nobody's going to wait for me, I can do it with this. It's pretty cool. And this paper is great because it comes in a block. And as you can see, I've got the clip on the end as well. So I basically flip the paper upside down so the glue is on the bottom. That keeps that smooth and hard and it doesn't get messed up in my lap. And then I just clip the open-ended stuff at the top. And here I actually painted over that log that I wanted to cross the creek. So I'm going to have to fix that later. One of the things I've done with this, and I don't have video of it later, but you can see how in the end you'll see the final result where I actually added a little bit of graphite with a 6B pencil and a little bit of white charcoal. And the white charcoal is great because it's actually brighter than this gray paper, and I love that. If you're using gouache, you could also use that. If you had acrylic, you could use that. I think I'm going to play with some acrylic on this too later on. But this being Inktober, I wanted to do some ink. Now you can see I'm putting some more trees and stuff up in there so it doesn't feel like it's so much sky. And again, it's just suggestions. All of this is suggestion. A lot of times when we think of fall foliage, we think of the trees and all those beautiful leaves that are going to be falling soon. One of the things that we learned about this trip, during this trip in Glacier, was how incredible the undergrowth can be. And that's something that I found really exciting here. All of this is brush. None of this is actual trees. The trees were burned in a fire. I'm trying to remember the date. Some years ago, and the undergrowth is all that you've got in some of these areas. So you'll see in the very last, you'll see the burned trunks just standing there. I was drawing those in so I knew where they go. Right now they're just pencil marks that are virtually hidden underneath everything else. Here I'm playing with the color of the water. Mostly yellow, some yellow and green. The rocks and the water are just incredible colors. So getting that to work with all the foliage was pretty fun. What I'm doing here, the style, is what I call emotional realism. It's close enough to reality that your mind doesn't question what it's looking at. But it is more important to depict what it felt like than exactly how it looked. When I first started doing artwork, I tried very, very hard to do exactly what I saw, and found that to be an interesting exercise, but not as exciting because I tended to get stiff. Now, there are people I know who can do it and don't get stiff, and it's amazing. For me, I've focused more on the emotional aspects of it. How does it feel when you're out there? Because if it feels right, then it will look right. And I think that's a fascinating bit. There you can see the block there where I'm using the green. This is A4 size, so it's not quite American letter size, a little bit thinner, a little bit longer. It's nice. You can still do an 8 by 10 on it. This would probably crop to about 8 by 10. So you can see there where when I go to get some color, I can actually swipe between the blocks and pick up a little bit of both. So it's like mixing on your brush in oils or gouache, but I'm just playing with it here. It also keeps the colors from getting too mixed up, because there's only a certain section of it I'll do that with. I'll use one end of the ink block and save the middle for pure color. There I'm using pure color of that green, that really light yellow green. And notice I went back up there because it's dry enough to play around with some more. The 200 GSM really does a good job of that. The 640 will take a big old wash, but I don't tend to work in washes. So as you see, I'm using this tiny brush. But this gives me a lot of options, both in terms of texture and just color coverage. And with the Inktense, I really like it intense. So it's fun to have more of a almost impressionistic feel to it. Notice also that I did not put masking tape down. I'm a real fan of Hahnemühle's own masking tape. That is like the perfect amount of tack for masking things like this or pastels, which I do. I love it for that. And in this case, when I'm doing when I'm painting with this kit, I usually don't have time to tape everything up, and I don't want to carry tape with me, so I just sort of do ragged edges. And you can either crop them out and mat it with those cropped off, or dry out with those cropped off, or you can just leave it and have a fade out edge, and I kind of like that look too. A lot of urban sketchers do that. I'm sort of an urban sketcher in the natural landscape, I think. This, of course, is in the studio, but in general, I love to be out there doing this. And again, you can see I'll grab several different colors. And putting in a little bit more of this foliage over here. The video doesn't actually show the final, but you'll see it in the last shot. You'll see the whole thing finished. A lot of great texture to be done in here. There's so much stuff up close. You'll notice also that I started with the big more of the big blocks and ended with more of the small ones. You see, I just barely drag it across there. Touch it if I have to. You'll notice at this point I'm starting to go into a lot more smaller movements. I think at this point, yeah, I'll start drawing those tree trunks back in. I'm following the ghost lines that I have underneath. I'm trying to go very finely. And I've got a finer brush that I could use, but I was in the middle of it and I just went for it. The ink tint dries a little bit lighter in color, or in value rather, when it dries. So unlike acrylic, which dries darker, the ink tint dries just a bit lighter. So I found that I tend to go over things multiple times to get the right value. Here I'm trying to make sure I can give you some depth by changing the angle. You're looking downstream, which is always interesting. There's a big one. I'm holding my finger on the edge of the paper to try and get myself to be able to do a straighter line. But they need to be angled somewhat, because if they're too straight, then it doesn't make sense. Plus, since you're looking down, the line should converge toward the middle. And that's a tricky thing to do. As always, I'm trying to vary the distances between things so that it looks more organic. If they're too even, then it's just a bunch of trees marching into the distance. It doesn't feel right. Or you're looking at a planted field, which in this case it wasn't. Again, I'm working on the Hahnemühle Watercolor Toned Paper. This is the gray. It's my favorite so far. I had a great time all week painting with this. I was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in Kalispell, Montana, in Glacier National Park for a couple of days, and then again in Kalispell, back out to the Idaho Panhandle, down to Spokane, and then down into the Wallowa Mountains of Oregon, which if you haven't seen those, please go. They are some of my favorite mountains on earth. Just beautiful. And we saw so much early fall. It was really exciting. And this was one of the highlights here, was this particular creek with the path. And on the gray toned paper, 200 GSM watercolor paper with a medium surface, it really was fun to do. You can see how nicely that ink tint goes down. Real simple setup, not hard to do. A few more tree trunks and then you'll see the final image where everything worked out. I used the white charcoal, a little bit of graphite, just to give it some extra punch. And thanks for watching.